Welcome back. Back in the good old days, one of the most popular events on the 4th of July was horse racing, especially out west. W.E. Utterback remembers one such Independence Day event in 4th of July race.
In the early days, Hagerman, New Mexico used to pull off some pretty good 4th of July celebrations. They had a grandstand in the park, which is now the Mineral Wells Apartments. The band would play and one or more speakers would give patriotic addresses. At noon, different families or groups would spread out their picnic lunches with plenty of lemonade to drink. Small boys would walk around selling pop, peanuts, and popcorn. Firecrackers were going off all over. We had no TV or cars in those days and had to make our own entertainment and fun. Generally, a baseball game was played against Dexter or some other town. Foot races were run with small boys, grown men, and sometimes girls and women. At night, a fireworks display was put on. One time, Ernest Lagenegger and Rich Carter fought a duel with Roman candles. Rich got hit in the chest and burned a hole in his shirt and some hide. He said that the skin would heal up, but that shirt cost a lot of money. One year, about the time the foot races were over, a rural-looking individual happened on the scene wearing blue bib overalls and work shoes. He said he was a farmer from East Grand Plains and was looking for a horse race. Someone asked him where his horse was, and he said it was hitched to a wagon on a vacant lot. Someone said, "Go get your horse," which he did, coming back leading a heavy-bodied, short-legged sorrel gelding, which was collar and harness marked. My brother Bert had a gray saddle horse which had outrun all the cow ponies around Hagerman in short races, and he matched his farmer for a 200-yard run. Another man agreed to run the East Grand Plains man 1/4 mile. This was all to be run in the same race. All three agreed I was to hold the stake money. The farmer said I had an honest-looking face, but he didn't know I was Bert's brother. The race was run on the east line of Hagerman, and quite a crowd went out to see the race. The farmer was riding bareback, and the horse had on a blind bridle with rope reins. All the farmer did to get ready was to get off the sorrel and take off his heavy work shoes. Well, all three lined up, and someone shot off a pistol to start the race. Holy cats! That old sorrel workhorse left there like he was shot out of a cannon. He beat Bert the 200 yards and also won the 1/4 mile race. When they came back, Bert said it wasn't a fair race. I said, "Wait a minute. I saw the start, and everything was on the up and up." He said that wasn't the trouble. The sorrel threw clouds of dust in his face, and he couldn't see. This was a country boy, not a city slicker, that took them in. Charged that one up to experience.
New Mexico wasn't the only place for a summertime horse race. J.B. Cearley recalls another race, this one in Post, Texas. The moral of J.B.'s story? Watch what you call a man's horse. He might end up challenging you to the greatest race. Since I was a big boy of 14 that year in 1932, I got a job during the early summer working on a ranch near Post, Texas. My dad was a good friend of the rancher. I was the flunky for the branding, helping with the branding irons, the cooking of the noon meal, and handling the horses. This was a happy time for me, and there are many things that I still remember with pleasant smiles when I think of my 6-week venture into ranching in the breaks below the great Caprock country of northwest Texas. The thing that was most deeply etched into my mind is the big race. It came about in the strangest of ways. Saturday afternoon was a free and happy time for the hands on the Bar J Ranch. We all rode the 11 miles into Post to walk up and down the 3 blocks of the business section, wearing out the concrete and our feet. I had ridden into town in the small bed behind the one seat in Red Barton's old hoopie, a 1925 Model T Ford. He had bought an old touring car, removed the back seat, and made a homemade bed for the back, creating a pickup. 3 other cowboys had ridden in the contraption with Red. Late that afternoon, we all gathered near the drugstore where we bought ice cream cones and were cooling our lips. Red suddenly laughed as he said, "That's the worst-looking horse I've ever seen in my whole life, and I'm 32 years old." He pointed toward a sway-belly horse tethered at the rack. People in West Texas often drove to town in a wagon or rode a horse. During the Great Depression, many did not have 10 cents for a gallon of gas. Tim Musgrove turned to look at his bay mare. He tilted his chin as he said, "That's as fine a piece of horse flesh as you've ever seen. Fine racer," he boasted. "Old Nell is a real horse." Milt Johnson exploded with laughter. He had a splendid black horse, one of the finest saddle ponies I'd ever seen. "Old Swaybelly is the grand champion racehorse of Texas," Milt said. "Perhaps the whole world." He laughed, slapping his legs and whooping at Tim. "Why don't you turn that old Swaybelly thing out to pasture?" "Send her to the glue factory," suggested Doug Ford. There was another round of laughter from the cowboys. Tim seemed to be enjoying their jokes and laughter about his old horse. "Sure enough," he claimed, seriously, "that horse is a real angel. She's sound as a silver dollar, doesn't eat much, and she's sure on her feet. You've seen me cutting out frisky steers with that mare. She has good wind, and she doesn't know the meaning of the word quit." "That horse hasn't got enough wind to blow out a candle, much less run a half-mile," Milt insisted. "Now my black gelding there can run circles around old Swaybelly. Now Dancer is a real horse." As far as Milt was concerned, the argument was finished. I knew that Dancer, Milt's horse, was a fine animal. I had marveled at the way Milt could ride and cut cattle during the roundup in the mesquite breaks. Then I saw Tim smiling like he had something hidden up his sleeve. "You boys are hurting Nell's feelings. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves." Tim was still smiling like he enjoyed their laughter at poor Nell. "Her belly is dragging the ground. Look at that rainbow in her back," Milt laughed. "Old Swaybelly will need a set of wheels to hold her belly up in another week." The laughter exploded again. I turned to look at the poor mare. She really was a swayback. Tim waited until the noise quieted. Then he spoke quietly himself. "She can outrun most any horse." He spoke like a pleading parson. Milt snickered. "That thing couldn't outrun a sick snake." Again Tim spoke gently. "Nell could outrun Dancer." Well, I figured the heat had gotten to Tim. That old horse of his was a good work animal, but I wouldn't run her against a donkey in a real race. "You're crazy," Milt snorted. "Dancer could burn that old horse in half a mile." "Who's interested in a half mile?" Tim asked. "I was thinking about a race back to the ranch." "Why, you're plumb loco," Milt said. "Give that poor mare a little handicap and I'll show you," Tim retorted. "What kind of handicap and how much do you want to bet?" "Well, I don't have any money," the owner of the swayback mare replied. "Give me a 10-minute head start on old Swaybelly and I'll race you." 10 minutes? Not on your life. I wouldn't run Dancer that far unless you made it worthwhile. How much cash you got?" "No cash," Tim said. "Give me a 10-minute head start and I'll take your saddle and $6 when we get back to the ranch. If you make it there, smarty." "My saddle is as good as yours," Milt spoke loudly. "Then you must be ashamed of your fine horse Dancer," Tim said, chuckling. "If I was as sure of a horse as you seem to be, I'd take most any bet." He smiled at Milt. Then Tim said, "Old Swaybelly here can probably outrun Red's Rattletrap Ford." He turned to look at the 6 100-pound bags of cottonseed meal in the small bed. Red exploded with, "My car? Well, that Ford has an engine I can outrun any horse alive." "Want to bet?" Tim was still smiling. Yes, I was sure poor Tim had gone plumb loco. The terribly hot summer had affected his thinking. Tim had a problem. After a 10-minute argument and much bragging about Dancer and the Hoopy, the race was finally set. Tim was to have a 3-minute head start on Swaybelly. John McCord was to watch the time, and Milt and the Ford were to start together. If Swaybelly won the 11-mile race, Tim got Milt's saddle and $3, and he also got Red's Ford Hoopy. If Tim lost, he was without a saddle, and he lost a month's wages to Red. He got $25 in cash each month, just what Red paid for the car. The clock was checked, then Tim rode off on Nell. He had her in a gentle lope when he turned the corner near the depot. Then he was out of sight, riding for the ranch on Swaybelly. I felt sorry for him. Red started the Ford engine. Then he called out, "Hop on, boys, let's get moving." "Hold it," said John McCord. "I'll tell you when to start." So we waited until he gave the word. Milt kicked Dancer in the ribs, and the beautiful black horse went racing along the 3 blocks of brick pavement. I saw the horse galloping easily, and I began to feel sorry for old Nell. She could never beat a horse like Dancer, even with a 10-minute handicap. I was sure that Tim would lose his only saddle and a month's wages. The heat had affected him, I figured. The old Ford finally got up enough speed to allow Red to shift the high-gear lever. It was clucking like a hen. The men and 6 sacks of feed were a heavy load for such a worn car. About a mile out of town, the Ford caught up with Milt on his horse. Dancer was puffing and beginning to sweat in the heat. The old Ford was rattling and creating a small dust cloud in its wake. I was standing in the bed and holding on to the back of the seat, searching for Tim and Nell. But I couldn't see them. Was Nell really that fast? When the Hoopy topped the crest of the little hill, it began to run faster. I glanced along the road, but I couldn't see Nell or Tim. Where had they gone so quickly? From the crest of the hill we could see almost 2 miles. When we came to the next little hill, the old Ford was hot and puffing. Red pulled the gas and spark levers down and held them together with his left hand. The engine was doing all it could, laboring under the load and the hill. The car slowed, but it finally crawled over the knoll. Then it picked up speed on the downgrade. We still couldn't see Nell. I turned and glanced back to see Milt whipping Dancer. He was fighting the horse and trying to make him run faster. 4 miles from the ranch, we began the approach to the last of the little hills on the dirt road. Red still had the car wide open, trying to catch Tim on Nell. As the car lumbered into the steep grade, I could tell that the motor was too hot. Some steam was spewing out from under the hood, but a determined Red kept the Ford wide open, desperate for greater speed. Just before the car reached the apex of the hill, steam blew out from the car in a gigantic display of rejection. The motor died and the car rolled to a stop. Red ground the starter, but the engine wouldn't respond. He raised the hood and removed the radiator cap, and we had a geyser. The remainder of the water and steam blew out, announcing Red's defeat. Furiously, Red grabbed the crank and began turning it as fast as he could. "Start, blast you!" he shouted, red-faced and sweating, but the old Ford was finished until it got water. 2 minutes later, Milt came storming by on Dancer. I watched the wheezing and sweating horse as Milt continued to fight for more speed. He seemed like a crazy man searching ahead for Tim and Swaybelly. I was dumbfounded. How could Nell travel at such speed? She seemed too old and tired for such a run in the terrible heat. A few minutes later, I was surprised to hear hoofbeats. I turned to see Nell and Tim gently loping along on their way to the ranch. He was going to beat Red, but what a speedy dancer! Tim was smiling like a kid at Christmas when he stopped by the car. He suddenly reached down and removed the ignition key. "You fellas can hoof it on back to the ranch," he spoke mildly. He turned to me. "Hop on behind me, son, and you can ride along." I jumped up behind the saddle and Tim clucked to Nell. She began her ground-covering trot. I finally got around to asking, "Where have you been, Tim?" "Well, I stopped Nell and made her lie down in that first ravine just outside Post. I watched as you fellows and Milt came by hightailing it like crazy. Nell is too good a horse to crowd on something like a simple little race. You're going to lose your saddle. Milt went by here moving fast a few minutes ago." "Oh," Tim said, I think we'll find Milt and Dancer before we get to the ranch, perhaps in just a minute or two. As soon as we turned the next corner with Nell still jogging along, we saw Milt and Dancer. I knew something had happened before we reached them. Milt was standing there, head down, looking dejectedly at Dancer. The fine horse was sprawled flat on the ground. Tim slowed as we approached Milt. He spoke softly. "Just take my saddle off and carry it to the ranch. Too bad old Swaybelly is going to beat your fine horse. You had to ride him to death. I feel sorry for a fool like you." So that was how Nell won the great race. Neither Red and his Ford nor Milt on his fine horse made it to the ranch, except by Shank's mare. In other words, they had to walk. Both Dancer and the car had died on the trip because their owners were trying to get more out of them than they had to give. When we got to the ranch, Tim got 2 gallons of water. Then he and I rode another ranch horse back to where his pickup was parked. We filled the radiator with water, then the engine started after Tim gave it a crank. He smiled at me as he said, "Son, let this be a lesson to you, understand? Now, you ride the pony back to the ranch, and I'll cluck along in my new Ford." I was happy to ride the ranch pony, and I was glad that Tim was my friend. He had taught me a real lesson that day. When did you know that summer was over? For most, it was the first school bell of the fall. For others, it might be the first frost. For Lillian Reeher's grandmother, the demarcation of summer's end was simple. For her, summer ended with the 4th.
At the risk of sounding old and maudlin, I drag out my memories of earlier summers in a small western Pennsylvania college town. Every once in a while, too, while I'm remembering those summers of my youth, I hear some child say, "But, Mom, there's nothing to do in Grove City." I think to myself, there never was, honey, and I had to get up early in the morning to get it all done before sunset or sleep, whichever came first. As long as I can remember, Grove City has been basically the same. Always there have been about 8,000 residents, summer and winter. I guess they haven't always been the same residents, but they added up to the same number, more or less. I guess that also means there have always been just about the same number of kids to play with. My early memories are filled with a Columbia Avenue neighborhood with an abundance of kids. I had a sandbox, and the kids catty-cornered from me had Kool-Aid. We needed little else but vigorous imaginations. Occasionally, the summer air split with fight words as we warred, or screams, when Philip Lawson appeared in my hollyhocks and threatened to eat worms. When it rained, we took off our shoes and waded in the gutter. When they tarred the road, We sat on the curb and watched until the compressor disappeared down the road. Some of us rushed out, picked off the tar, and chewed it until we could spit black onto the hot concrete. Those were the days when the boys amazed us by demonstrating how far they could spit. We girls were hopeless in the competition until Patty McCutcheon showed us how to chew pine needles, which she promised would produce green spit. I remember that vividly, because I swallowed quite a chunk of pine branch and had to eat slices of bread to cushion the sharpness, or so said Doc Jameson. And that was the same summer I absent-mindedly dropped my guinea pig, Mr. Dooley, into the commode instead of his cage and was terrified he would die of pneumonia. I dried him vigorously with my bath towel, and he rallied rather rapidly. There was always some excitement like that. Later they created the Stewart Avenue playground behind my house, and there were craft programs and organized play, but what we liked best was sliding down the slide on sheets of waxed paper. When I was old enough, the swimming pool was my second home. The park roads weren't paved then, but they were oiled. My end of town always smelled of oil. I could hardly wait for the pool to open at 1 p.m. I'd leave the house extra early to traipse to the park, where I'd sit anxiously on a bench until the lifeguards showed up to open the bathhouse. I was usually the last one out of the pool. It always seemed as though I had been there just for an hour or so before the thing closed up again. When I wasn't at the pool, I was at a library. Town library, school library, college library, anywhere I could get a book. Sometimes I was actually grateful it rained because it gave me a chance to catch up on reading. The summer climaxed with the 4th of July. My grandmother always said summer was gone after that. I never questioned the logic, just accepted it as fact. In those days, there were fireworks down by the Grove City College lagoon. The stadium and hills around were filled with spectators. My grandmother's home was across the street, and there was always a crowd of visitors lining the porch, usually eating watermelon. My heart raced with excitement for days before as we set off sparklers. By the night of the 4th, it was hard to tell if the booming was coming from the firecrackers or from inside my chest. There was something about the display that set off waves of fierce patriotism in all of us. The finale always included an American flag, and that, I believed, was the end of summer. My grandmother and her friends always wore white shoes. Memorial Day until Labor Day, Nanny said, was the only time to wear them. Each afternoon, Nanny cleaned up from her chores, put on her white shoes, and set off for Down Street. Sometimes I went with her, but I lost interest after we left the 5 and 10. Every so often, someone's cousins came to town to visit. We would spend several days eyeing the new kids and noting how very different kids from other towns were. By the last few weeks in August, things were starting to wind down. It was too hot to do much but read in the rope swing until the evening brought breezy relief. We wandered over to Corby service station to buy a popsicle, which we always split with someone or other. I never knew of a kid who was allowed to eat both halves. Oh, Grove City has changed somewhat over the years. It's better, I guess. The pool, the park, the playgrounds, the libraries. But being better hasn't spoiled the basics. They're still there for the kids who have enough hours in the day to find them. When it rains, I still look longingly at the gutters on the less traveled streets, and I miss the fireworks.
Finally, lest we forget the reason we celebrate the 4th of July, here is a poem about when freedom first rang in our country. Those were the days when the love of freedom was called treason and rebellion, and was paid for by the blood of patriots. May we never forget the message of the Independence Bell. There was a tumult in the city, in the quaint old Quaker town, and the streets were rife with people pacing restless up and down, people gathering at corners where they whispered each to each, and the sweat stood on their temples with the earnestness of speech. As the bleak Atlantic currents lashed the wild Newfoundland shore, so they beat against the State House, so they surged against the door. And the mingling of their voices made the harmony profound, till the quiet street of Chestnut was all turbulent with sound. Will they do it? Dare they do it? Who is speaking? What's the news? What of Adams? What of Sherman? Oh God, grant they don't refuse. Make some way there. Let me nearer. I'm stifling. Stifle then. When a nation's life at hazard, we've no time to think of men. So they surged against the State House, while all solemnly inside sat the Continental Congress, truth and reason for their guide. Or a simple scroll debating which, though simple it might be, yet should shake the cliffs of England with thunders of the free. Far aloft in that high steeple sat the bellman, old and gray. He was weary of the tyrant and his iron-sceptred sway. So he sat with one hand ready on the clapper of the bell, where his eye could catch the signal, the long-expected news to tell. See, see, the dense crowd quivers through all its lengthy line as the boy beside the portal hastens forth to give the sign. With his little hands uplifted, breezes dallying with his hair. Hark! With deep, clear intonation, breaks his young voice on the air. Hush the people's swelling murmur whilst the boy cries joyously, Ring! He shouts, Ring, Grandpapa! Ring, oh ring for liberty! Quickly at the given signal, the old bellman lifts his hand. Forth he sends the good news, making iron music through the land. How they shouted! What rejoicing! How the old bell shook the air, till the clang of freedom ruffled the calmly gliding Delaware. How the bonfires and the torches lighted up the night's repose, and from the flames, like fabled phoenix, our glorious liberty arose. The old State House bell is silent, hushed is now its clamorous tongue, but the spirit it awakens still is living, ever young. And when we greet the smiling sunlight on the 4th of each July, we will ne'er forget the bellman who betwixt the earth and sky rung out loudly independence, which, please God, shall never die. I hope you've enjoyed this look at those patriotic times back in the good old days. This is Ken Tate, editor of Good Old Days magazine, reminding you to always remember the best. And God bless.